Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm the chairman of the Friends of the South Downs, and most of you will know that we exist and have done for 100 years to preserve, protect, defend, and, if appropriate, improve our wonderful national park. We decided as part of our centenary that we would have some VIP speakers through the year. And I'm pleased to introduce the first of those who'll be speaking to us in just a minute. Can I say, though, before that if you have any questions, you're very welcome to field them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please don't use the chat. We're not going to look at the chat. And then I shall pass the questions on to George at the end. So, welcome to George. My only relationship with George at the moment is that he's made me feel really bad about my wood-burning fire. But I know he has one as well, so we can both be embarrassed. So, George, over to you.
Thanks very much, David, and great to talk to you all. So I'd like to talk about our relationship with land in the UK. And it's quite a topical conversation right now because of the decision not far from where I'm living at the moment in Dartmoor about wild camping. And I think this High Court decision really cuts to the heart of some of the key issues concerning our relationship to what could be described as our most important resource, a resource without which we have nothing. Now, I expect you're all aware, but just in case you're not, a few days ago at the High Court, a case was determined which had been brought by a major landowner on Dartmoor, a hedge fund manager called Alexander Darwell, who in 2011 bought a 4,000-acre estate on Dartmoor, and he challenged the right to wild camp on that estate and indeed over the rest of Dartmoor. Now, Dartmoor was the last place in England and Wales where you can camp wild, in other words, camp without the permission of the landowner. And this was seen by a lot of people as a pretty fundamental right. I mean, the right to pitch a tent which incidentally of the kind you have to carry on your back, not one of those huge family tents, seem to be sort of pretty fundamental to our identity, who we are, where we stand in relation to the very fabric of this country. And it was a presumed right because under the Dartmoor Commons Act 1985, it says that people have a right to recreation, which is with access on foot or on horseback to the park. There were some prescribed activities which were listed, things like lighting fires, which, as we'll come on to in a moment, is slightly paradoxical. And this camping was not listed among those prescribed activities. But no definition was given of what the legitimate activities were. So it's just recreation was the generalized term. And Alexander Darwell, the landowner, challenged this in court. He says that because it doesn't specify the right to wild camp, then there is no such right. And unfortunately, the judge in the case agreed with that argument. And overnight, the right to wild camp in the last place in England and Wales where you can do it was struck down. It seems like an extraordinary judgment because on exactly the same grounds that the right is not specified, it's not named, you could lose your right to go bird watching or rock climbing or to talk or to sing or to sit on a rock and gaze at the view. Any of those rights could potentially be struck down on exactly the same legal arguments because they're not specified in the 1985 Act. Now, I find this highly significant because these were the means by which the land rights of the great majority of people in England, Scotland in particular, before that actually in Ireland, and then across the British Empire were terminated. you might have what appeared to be a long-standing right, something that you and your ancestors had done for centuries over a piece of land. But the legalistic argument was that if that right is not specified in a written title, that does not exist. And this is the means by which vast numbers of commoners were kicked off the land during the English enclosures. The enclosures really began in the 14th century as Cistercian monasteries established their large estates and found that it was very lucrative to concentrate on a monoculture of sheep production, primarily for the wool trade, which was an extremely valuable trade at the time, and that you need very few people to keep sheep, and that you can keep sheep on pretty rough land, the commons and the wastes of the manor. And so it was in their economic interest to chuck everyone off and replace them with sheep. And by the time Thomas More came to write Utopia in the early 16th century, he described about how he talked about how the sheep swallowed down the very men themselves and have become this powerful, monstrous creature which destroy entire homesteads and towns by sweeping away all the people and replacing them. And what was used then and ever since, particularly in the Acts of Enclosure, following the English Civil War, which really reached a peak during the 18th century, but continued well into the 19th century, was that the legalistic definition of who has rights to the land trumped the common understanding and long-standing practice of who has been using that land peacefully for many centuries. And if it wasn't written in the title, your right did not exist. And then that moved up to Scotland and was the driving force of the Highland clearances, and indeed the Lowland clearances, greatly neglected in history, but just as deadly for the people of the Lowlands as they were in the Highlands. A process very well documented by Andy Whiteman's book, The Poor Had No Lawyers. And similarly to the current case, if you've got the right lawyers in your case, and you've got the legal fiction of written title, then you are the legitimate owner of the land, regardless of where you live, what your stake in that land is, what you've done in the past, and what the other people whom you can then evict were doing. And so you had absentee landowners or absentee claimants who had no relationship to the land whatsoever, using that legal fiction of written title to clear people whose families had lived on that land for many hundreds of years, and whose land rights were never assumed to require any written confirmation because they were so well established and well known. And then that same ethos was spread across Britain's empire, and indeed other European empires, right across the Americas, right through Africa and Australia. Basically, wherever we landed, we used that very powerful tool of written title to say, you've got no rights. This is a terra nullius. It is a land without people. And we establish our right to own and control this land because we have a piece of paper which says that it's us who own it and not you. And that became this legalistic justification for what were plainly, utterly unjust and unwarranted evictions of the local people, the indigenous people who had lived there for so long. And this really became the basis of our modern economic system, with its great concentration of both wealth and political power. You could take it back, for instance, to John Locke's second treatise, written, I think, in 1685. John Locke was a colonial administrator, a secretary to the Lords Protectors of Carolina. And he wrote this treatise, which claimed that your right to own the land springs from mixing your labor with that land. So as soon as you stick your spade in the ground and turn over a turf, you have established the right to own that land. And it's a very peculiar argument. In fact, it's a deeply weird argument. It's about as bizarre as the average Spectator column, in that it just makes no sense whatsoever. So, because what Locke assumes is that there is a year zero. There's a point at which this mythical person can turn up with their spade, stick the spade in the ground, and then say, I own this, because no one has ever stuck a spade in the ground before. But of course, in the Americas, which he was specifically talking about, that land had been used and in some cases cultivated and certainly changed by people for many, many centuries, for thousands of years. And they had mixed their labor with the land, but they didn't count. And Locke extended this further to say, in the beginning, all the world was America, meaning that all the world was unclaimed and just waiting for this person, a European man, to turn up and stick a spade in it and then say, I've mixed my labor with the ground, with the land, I own it. So you then say, okay, fine. I'm going to come along to your land and stick a spade in your land and mix my labor with the land, so I own it. But no, strangely, that right is established once and once only at a particular moment of history chosen by the colonizer to say, this is the moment when suddenly everything is swept away. There are no past land rights. There are no future land rights. The only right that exists is my right right now of sticking my spade in the ground and mixing my labor with it. But Locke went further with the assumption that your labor is not just your actual physical labor, but includes the labor of those working for you. So you don't actually have to mix your labor with the land. You just have to ask somebody else to mix their labor with the land, and you have established your land right by that means. And given that the predominant mode of labor controlled by Europeans at that time in the Americas was slavery, to establish widespread land rights, you had to deploy a lot of slaves. And what John Locke did, in effect, was to create a charter for the rights of slave owners. And yet this utterly bizarre, I mean, frankly, totally weird set of arguments has come to be seen as the sort of founding charter for the economy and our relationship with the land, which has come to shape so much of our political and economic life. I mean, it is totally bizarre, and it is a legal fiction as strange as the legal fiction of turning up in Australia with a document saying, I own the land because I've got this document. The fact that you've got the land doesn't confer any land rights to you whatsoever. The fact that I have a piece of paper, that confers the land right. And so what we see throughout these past few hundred years of history is really a means by which, through arming themselves with lawyers and arming themselves with certain documents written in copper plate and with seals and ribbons to make it all look official, a very small group of people have asserted rights to something which once belonged to everyone and no one, or belonged broadly and generally to a particular group, a community which invested its time, its labor, its love, its culture, whatever, in a particular tract of land. And we have normalized this to such an extent that this hedge fund manager who bought his land in 2011 can come along and terminate rights across the entirety of Dartmoor without actually any process establishing whether those rights existed or not, because the court case didn't even try to do that. It just said, well, if it's not written down, it's not there, as if it's only the thing that's in writing that confers the right. There is no other way of establishing that right. And I think that this strange relationship and this power-laden relationship between people and land, particularly in the UK, particularly in England, where so much of this began and then was spread out into much of the rest of the world. I think this explains a lot about our broken relationship with our lovely places and with the wildlife that inhabits them. As you may know, Britain is amongst the most nature depleted places in the world. We also have one of the lowest levels of engagement with the living world. We have very large numbers of people who love to walk in the countryside, but a remarkable level of public ignorance and, to a very great extent, exclusion. A study by the Right to Roam campaign shows that in England, only 8% of the land surface has a right to roam over it. 92% is close to us. And this right to roam is very unevenly distributed. There's quite a lot of land in the northwest of England with a right to roam, and almost none in the centre and Midlands of England. There's huge tracts where you can go for many miles without any right to roam land whatsoever. There can be footpaths, and we've got lots of footpaths in this country, well, at least on the map. A lot of them are closed and inaccessible, and a lot of them are really miserable places, in my experience at any rate. You get this very narrow path between two high fences where you feel just as locked in as you are in the city. I walk in the countryside to try to escape this linear, gridded, controlled world that we create in our settlements, to try to immerse myself in a different world altogether, which is the world of nature, this self-willed, self-regulated world full of serendipity and surprise. But to a large extent, you can't find that in many of the places you would expect to, and particularly in our national parks. Now, the South Downs is an exception because it's the national park has some characteristics not shared with most others, but the majority of our national parks in the UK are basically glorified sheep ranches. They have scarcely any more wildlife than the lands that surround them outside the park boundaries. So if I can return to the example of Dartmoor, because it's so fresh in my mind, the dominant natural ecosystem here, if it were left to nature, would be rainforest. That might sound surprising to people because we associate rainforest with the tropics, but actually rainforest is forest that's wet enough to support epiphytes. In other words, plants that grow on plants. I'm not talking about ivy, which is rooted in the ground. I'm talking about plants which are rooted in the bark of trees. So, for instance, polypody, this fern which grows on trees in many places around here in the southwest and other parts of Western Britain, or indeed the rich mosses and lichens, various other fern species, and quite a few vascular plants as well, seed-bearing plants too. You'll also find growing on trees around here. This is land which wants to be rainforest, one of the richest and rarest of our ecosystems, and is confined here to a few tiny, narrow valleys, whereas much of the moor now has been completely taken over by this single species of grass called Millennia, or purple moorgrass. And Millennia is a sign of a really abused piece of land. What has happened here, and this is where this paradox of campers being forbidden to have barbecues or to burn anything, which is quite right, of course they should be forbidden, but it's what makes it so ironic is that on Dartmoor there's this tradition called swaling, and swaling means burning. It means systematically burning the land whenever nature seeks to recover. So as heather or gorse returns, young trees growing among it, the sheep farmers get together in the winter and set light to that land, and they've been doing so for years and years, and every time they do so they turn the ratchet a little bit further towards ecological collapse. And because there's only so much of that damage that the land can take, what they claim to be doing is to clear off all the thick vegetation so that the grass can put up new green shoots which their sheep can eat. But every time they do it, they get fewer green shoots, and they get more and more establishment of this tussock forming grass, Millennia, which is a sort of end state of a degraded landscape, because once it is established, it takes over completely. And the tussocks are so deep and thick that other plant species can't get through them. No germinating root can cut down into the ground. And so what you get eventually, and there are many tracts of land in the uplands of Britain now which look like this, is a millennia monoculture, where it's just one species of grass covering the land for miles and miles. And once this has become fully established, it basically is irreversible. It can't recover by itself. And then you have the formation of a terrestrial dead zone. So in the Cambrian Mountains, for instance, in mid-Wales, there's a dead zone of around 300 square kilometres. It's scarcely discussed. It's amazing how we neglect these issues. But it's basically a millennia desert with nothing but millennia living there. No birds, no insects, no flowers, just this single grass species going on and on. The sheep can't eat it. It's too coarse for the sheep. So they were taken off about 40 years ago. And you would expect that landscape to recover, but it hasn't. It stayed in exactly the same state. And the reason for this is something that systems theorists call hysteresis. And hysteresis is the principle that once a complex system is tipped into a new equilibrium state, in other words, collapsed, it requires far more energy to tip it back into its prior state than was required to tip it past its tipping point. Because millennia forms this stable, thick blanket, nature can't come back. The tree seedlings can't root into it. And so it just stays like that and stays like that indefinitely until humans intervene. And the intervention has to be pretty extreme to reverse that level of damage. There's been very little research conducted on how best to do that. We just ignore it and move on. We just tend not to look after a while. We say, we'll just tell some myth about what a wonderful ecosystem this is and forget what's actually going on there, and just not visit large tracts of the land because they're so horrible. And we just move on and carry on damaging more and more land. But there has been some work done by people like the Borders Forest Trust, where you got very similar millennia monocultures in the Scottish Borders, who have found that with really intense work, tree planting, and it's very tough on steep slopes, boggy ground, you can eventually establish trees which will shade out the millennia and then allow other species to come back in as the millennia dies off. But it's a huge amount of work. And while that's going on, we're still seeing this burning, this devastating treatment of the land, which inevitably creates these millennia deserts going on and being celebrated even by the national park, saying this is part of our heritage, it's part of our cultural tradition. Well, judicial torture and mutilation is part of our heritage and our cultural tradition, but that does not make it right. But because we have this broken relationship with the land, broken by this enclosure, these clearances, the legal fictions of mixing your labor with the land, a written title, of all the other post hoc justifications that the possessive class creates in order to justify their grabbing of other people's livelihoods and other people's subsistence, we find it very hard to challenge these things. I mean, even to challenge them in words, because in order to do so, you have to break the force field that surrounds land ownership, particularly agricultural land ownership. There's a force that I call agricultural hegemony. Antonio Gramsci, the great political philosopher, talked of cultural hegemony, which means that the themes and beliefs of the ruling class become the themes and beliefs of society as a whole, that we adopt the claims that power makes for itself. And so I've adapted that slightly to create the phrase agricultural hegemony, where what prevails in the countryside is what the owners of the land want, and the way we see it tends to be the way that they see it. But in England, even using the maximal definition of what a farmer is, including all the partners in the business, the relationship partners of the farmers, the managers, even if you include everyone who could possibly be considered a farmer in England, only 3% of the rural population are farmers. 97% of rural people are not farmers. And yet when you say rural people or say the countryside, the image that immediately comes to mind, right, is of a farmer. And rural people who aren't farmers, and 97% of them, are among the least represented people in Britain. There is no political party which has a special position for those 97% of rural people. In fact, when it comes to rural affairs, basically, political parties talk about agriculture and everything else is an afterthought. And as a result, I feel that the writ of democracy scarcely runs in the British countryside. All too often, there's a sort of mafia-like politics where a few very dominant, powerful families, often farming families or other people with land-based economies, control the council, control the local newspapers, control the whole discussion about what happens where. And so to go to another part of the country, if we look at the River Wye, which forms, I know there's 3 River Wyes, but this is the one that forms part of the border between England and Wales, one of the most stunning, lovely ecosystems in Britain, covered with every sort of ecological protection you can imagine. It's got all the conservation designations, and it is dying in front of our eyes. And the reason for that is that councils in the catchment, Powys in particular, but also Herefordshire and Shropshire, dominated by these same farming interests, have granted permission after permission for chicken factories in the catchment. And the thing about any intensive animal agricultural operation is that you have to bring in the feed to feed the very large numbers of animals inside these gigantic steel factories. And as the animals consume that feed, they poop out a lot of the nutrients. And that manure can be very potentially useful as a soil additive. But when it exceeds a certain point, it becomes an absolute menace. And the thing about these intensive livestock units is that they produce far more manure than the land can absorb. And farmers spread it on their land saying, look, we're fertilizing the land, but actually they're dumping it. The soil can't absorb that much, the plants can't absorb that much. So all the surplus is immediately washed off into the nearest stream, which then goes into the nearest river. And the River Wye, which is the basis of the non-farming rural economy. In fact, it contributes far more to the local economy than farming does, because of all the kayaking and the canoeing and the swimming and the fishing and the picnicking and all the other things that draws people to the region and supports the tourism and the catering and the accommodation industries. All those are being destroyed by the fact that it is being turned into an open sewer, because there's no obligation to consider the cumulative impact of all these excess nutrients being put in the catchment as permission after permission after permission is granted, often by people within the very sector that they are considering when planning applications come before them. We would recognize it in any other circumstance as a corrupt situation, but because it's farming, and farming is surrounded by a kind of moral force field and supported by agricultural hegemony, we apply radically different standards. So to stick with rivers for a moment, we've all become aware of the absolutely terrible things that the water companies are doing to our rivers. And you in the southern water catchment will be more aware than most, and not just the rivers, of course, the sea as well. And the southern water's been had huge fines for dumping raw sewage in enormous quantities, but those fines are just part of its cost of doing business. They probably set aside the money from the outset because they knew they would have to pay them, and it still costs less to pay the fines than it does to invest in the up-to-date water treatment works that they should have been investing in, instead of nicking all the money and giving it to their shareholders in the form of dividends. And we're well aware of that. We're well aware of the terrible things these water companies are doing. But what scarcely anyone knows is that sewage pollution is only the second most important form of river pollution in this country. Farm pollution is the top cause, and yet we scarcely ever talk about it. Even if all the water companies were forced to clean up their act, and boy do they need to, we would still have a situation where almost every river in Britain is in poor ecological condition, and that's because of farming. And catchments almost everywhere are both overloaded by manure, but also polluted by farm chemicals. And that can, in some places, be exacerbated by the abstraction of water for farm irrigation as well. And yet we turn a blind eye to all this. We apply these radically different standards. We demand change from the water industry, as indeed we should, but we don't demand a corresponding level of change from the farming industry, because it has a no trespassing sign in front of it. And it's not just a question of restricting our physical access to the land. It's also about restricting our intellectual access, our cultural access, our political access to the land. We don't go there. We believe, well, if it's farming, that's for the farmers. It's not up to us. Even though as a proportion of the national population, the total population, farmers are 0.3%. So 99.7% of people in England are not farmers. 97% of rural people in England are not farmers. And yet we say, we're just going to leave this whole landmass to the farmers to decide what to do. And so we get these utterly perverse outcomes where, for instance, 51% of the United Kingdom is for grazing land, and yet it produces scarcely any of our calories. It's so unproductive, and yet so phenomenally destructive, because through grazing and often the associated burning, but grazing alone will do it, we have seen ecosystems reduce to just grass deserts. Tree seedlings are highly nutritious, even when you're not burning the land. Sheep in particular will seek them out and selectively nibble them away because they're tasty and they're full of nutrients. And you end up in a situation, and we've seen this plenty in Wales and Scotland in particular, where woodlands gradually disappear, because as the old trees die off, there are no young ones to replace them, because all the seedlings have been eaten. The Lake District too, this is a devastating impact, where gradually, in ways which people scarcely notice because it happens slowly, the woodlands retreat, as there's simply no age structure. You many places you'll go, there's no trees younger than about a century old. In fact, they date back to the last major agricultural recession in the 1920s and 1930s in England, and since then there's nothing, because of the sheep being kept on the land, and those sheep are there only because of public subsidies. It's us paying for this massive environmental destruction that sustains it, because sheep farming everywhere in the UK is loss-making, and particularly in the uplands. It would be a far more rational use of the land to stop farming it and to use it for ecological restoration instead, for rewilding. And in fact, I believe that's what we should do throughout our grade 4 and grade 5 agricultural land. We would lose almost nothing in terms of food production, and we would gain massively in terms of those two things which at the beginning of the talk I mentioned as being so depleted in this country, which is first of all nature, and secondly our engagement with nature. And I think one of the reasons why people are so disengaged from nature in this country is there is so little of it. It's just unappealing often. There's nothing but the same gridded, bleak monocultures we're trying to escape when we walk into the countryside. And what I think so many of us want to see is a rich, recovering, engaging, absorbing landscape where you're never quite sure which species might pop up, what you might see next, how things might develop. And that is the joy of nature. It's spontaneity and it's serendipity. But we've managed that almost out of existence in this country. So what we need is not just better environmental policies, but boy, do we need them. But we also need really a redefinition of our relationship with the land, a definition that extends into politics, into economics, into society, into cultural issues, to see ourselves as citizens of the land and of the land as being woven into our lives. But that can't happen while everything belongs to a small number of people who claim a hegemony over how that land should be managed. We should be sharing rights in the land. We should have our voices heard. We should have a say in how the land is managed, where the development takes place, but also what happens within the agricultural zone. And until we have that say, our engagement with the land and with nature will always be limited. We need to be brought back into the picture. And for that to happen, we must, both physically, I believe, but also and especially intellectually, march past those no trespassing signs. Thank you.
Sorry, George, I was getting myself back online. There we go. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, we could have listened to that for another half hour. How very stimulating, etc. I've written down loads of things myself. It was difficult to keep writing, when you were talking, and I'm also looking at the questions. So perhaps I can just address one or two of the questions and also just chip in myself on behalf of the society. I'll mention the first one from James, who says, no urgent question. What a terrific guy George is. Well done to us for getting you here. So I'll go along with that one, James. Well done. Yes. Another James, who's a farmer, and makes the point that they're really proud of what they produce on their land in terms of habitats, bird boxes, beehives, and producing 4 million litres of milk. And you do, as you walk through the countryside, you do see farms like that, don't you, where they're really going flat out to maintain habitats, etc. And then...
Shall I answer that question?
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Sure. Thanks. No, thank you very much, James. So, I'd say that a lot of farmers really are trying to do better. The incentives are very strongly against them. We would hope that with environmental land management, if that ever does materialize, those incentives will change. But, while we do see these, things like bird boxes and little corners of habitat, when you compare it to what would be there if those forms of farming weren't taking place, incredibly rich mosaics of ecosystems with wildlife and people being able to move freely through them, that's the point at which you begin to understand just how much we have lost. And I'm sorry to say, but dairy farming is the biggest cause of agricultural pollution of our rivers. Particularly as the scale of dairy works has increased, concentration of dairy farms with herds getting bigger. Again, we have that age-old problem of the land being unable to absorb the amount of manure being produced by the farms. So, for instance, the reason I became a vegan was what I saw on the River Culm in eastern Devon, where I'd gone to enjoy the river and found it was a sewer. And when I investigated, I followed a pipe up to a dairy farm which had been built from the lip of the Slurry Lagoon straight down into the river. And when I looked on Google Maps, I found that the size of the dairy unit had doubled, but the size of the Slurry Lagoons had not been changed. They were exactly the same as they'd been before. And instead, the surplus slurry just went straight down into the river. I rang the Environment Agency's pollution hotline. They promised to investigate. When I checked up 2 weeks later, they said they weren't going to take action because it was not a serious incident. And I said, what do you mean it's not a serious incident? The river is dead. There's nothing living in there but sewage fungus, and it's deliberate. And they said, well, so we found no evidence of a fish kill. And I said, why the hell would you find any evidence of a fish kill? There haven't been fish living there for months. And so I wrote an article in The Guardian saying, what does a farmer have to do to get prosecuted? Detonate an atom bomb. And I had two separate whistleblowers from the Environment Agency got hold of me and said, we've been instructed from the top, the Secretary of State, who at the time incidentally was Liz Truss, not to enforce against dairy farmers. And though the Secretary of State has changed, that remains more or less the status quo. That when you look at catchment studies, and actually the only two in Britain have been done in Devon, in North Devon and South Devon, you'll find that just about every single dairy farmer there is breaking the law by applying slurry on the land at times when they shouldn't, leaking slurry lagoons, all the rest of it, and yet there's no prosecution whatsoever happening. So this is a rogue industry, and I know that some people are trying to do much better than others, but they're constantly being squeezed. Their margins are being squeezed, and so the temptation to cut corners is there all the time. We're seeing the industry supported by more and more frequently cut ryegrass silage monocultures, where it's basically green concrete, nothing else can live in these places, particularly if you're cutting 3 or 4 times, or in some cases even 5 times a year. You create a totally barren green desert. We also see maize being grown to feed dairy cows with devastating impacts. Maize is the most erosion causing crop in the UK. So for all these reasons, we should be getting out of dairy. Dairy is just not a sustainable industry. There are 2 things we need to do above all others to protect and restore the living planet. One is to leave fossil fuels in the ground. The other is to stop farming animals.
Gosh, right. I don't know how to respond to that one. I think I must pick up the point that James made, that there are a lot of farmers. We can't blanket them all with the sort of comments you're making. Some are trying.
Actually, I'm not blaming any farmers. This is a matter of policy, and it's a matter of policy that in some respects goes back hundreds of years, but it's also a matter of current policy which could be changed. In many cases, we're looking at forms of farming which would not exist at all if it weren't for public money. And public money should be paid for public goods. It should not be paid for environmental destruction or for animal cruelty, for that matter. And so, we need a radical reevaluation of the relationship between government and farming, the public and farming, farming and wildlife, farming and the countryside, and not just a little bit of tweaking at the margins. We need to rethink this from first principles. Agriculture is by far and away the most damaging thing we've ever done to the planet. It's the major cause of deforestation, of habitat destruction, of wildlife loss, of species extinction, of freshwater use, of land use, of soil erosion, one of the major causes of climate breakdown, of freshwater pollution and of air pollution. And yet, because of our radical double standards, we don't see it as such, and we tend to protect it from public scrutiny. Now, we obviously all need farming to survive, but we also all need a thriving, living planet to survive. And if we're going to reconcile those 2 objectives, which are currently at odds, we need a substantial rethinking of this, and we need to abandon our double standards and demand the same levels of environmental protection from farming as we demand from all other industries.
Okay. All right. Yes. I've got 1 or 2 other questions, but I think a lot of them I wrote down right at the start. You said ignorance and exclusion was a big issue, and nobody's arguing that. And somebody else, David, is saying, how do we spread the message? How do we engage with people who are not interested or worse, etc.? I can really tie that up with, if you were the chairman of the Friends of the South Downs, what would be your priority? What's
Well, for a start, no one would ever be so foolish as to make me chairman of anything.
All right.
I wouldn't make myself chairman of anything. But it's, and I'm not, I've visited the South Downs a few times, but I wouldn't really presume to say very much about the South Downs, other than that I've seen some very worrying forms of land management there. But I would say in general, there has been a tendency to blame ordinary people who are effectively powerless in the countryside disproportionately for damage done to it. So in this court case on Dartmoor, The argument that the landowner was using was that wild campers might damage the land. There's no evidence of any significant damage at all done by wild campers on Dartmoor, but there is tremendous damage done to Dartmoor, not by wild campers, but by people deliberately setting light to it every year, people who happen to be sheep farmers. Now, if you or I did this, we could face a severe prison sentence for arson. But, because it's farming and it's sort of surrounded by this entirely different ethos, this different ethics, it's celebrated as part of our cultural heritage. And so often, the effort is to unload responsibility from those with power onto those who have no power, and not just in this field, but in so many aspects of human society. You get the finger pointed at powerless people. So, for instance, you have a real squeeze on wages and a squeeze on housing because of all sorts of structural forces governed by extremely powerful people in this country. And yet the finger gets pointed at refugees, taking our jobs, driving down labour standards, taking our homes. And actually refugees, these are the most vulnerable people on earth. They have nothing. They've got no power in this situation at all, but they get blamed for what other people in power are doing. And it's the oldest trick in the book to scapegoat effectively powerless people for what powerful people are doing. Now, obviously, we do need much better public engagement with the countryside, and we need better public understanding of the countryside as well.
Yeah.
And you would hope that starts in schools. But and I've done some volunteering for adventure learning and outdoor education charities. They used to be thriving in this country, but because of the cuts, they're pretty well all closed now. There just isn't any money for them. They depend on local authority funding, and the local authorities have had to cut everything except their essential services. And this, bizarrely, is considered an inessential service. One thing we used to do was to take children to the countryside for the very first time in their lives. So as charity I work with, working in Lewisham and Woolwich, with kids, most of whom had never seen the countryside and never seen the sea. These were 10-year-olds we mostly worked with, year sixes. And we would take them to fairly ordinary places in the countryside and the sea, a woodland, a rocky beach, and they would go absolutely crazy with delight and wonder and joy at engaging with these places which they'd never ever seen before. And that should not be a rare and exceptional experience for children like that. It should be a regular experience, but because the funding has been cut, it's not even a rare and exceptional experience anymore. They'll get to adulthood without ever having been to the countryside or without ever having seen the sea. How can we expect people to understand and respect the land and the sea if they've never even been there? And when they do, there's so little help and guidance. We really need to rethink all this and put some serious funding into bringing children back into a relationship with the land. Because if my experience is anything to go by, when children are introduced to it, they embrace the opportunity gleefully. They desperately want to have that contact, but we've cut them off from it.
I think hopefully I could let you know that we have, for our centenary, we have put a fair amount of money into taking children from the 5 most deprived schools in the area by coach onto the Downs,
right,
to do just what you're saying. The exciting bit about it is it's really not that expensive to do. I'm disappointed we haven't done it before, but anyway, we shall continue with that. But it's a small chink, but I mean it's a start, isn't it? We said we'd only have a few questions. I think the last one, I don't know quite where it's coming from, but should the South Downs be ploughed up?
No, I would say. Now, again, I'm no expert in the South Downs, but my understanding is that most of it is probably grade 3. It's not, particularly the upland parts are not good land for agriculture, and it would be foolish. I mean, it already, we've seen a lot of land which I think shouldn't have been ploughed in our chalky, flinty hills, which often becomes highly susceptible to soil erosion. I'm not sure why anyone would advocate such a thing, and I'm certainly not advocating it myself. I mean, we need to make strategic land decisions here. good land, grades 1 and 2, should be used to grow crops, and those crops should be for people, not for livestock, because that's a far more efficient way of using the land.
Yeah.
And that land should be farmed with the aim of high yields and low impacts. To avoid the two huge issues that agriculture is causing. One is the impact of pesticides, of fertilizers, of water abstraction, of soil erosion caused by the intensive use of the land. And the other is the agricultural sprawl caused by the extensive use of the land, using very large amounts of land to produce very little food and creating massive ecological and carbon opportunity costs, because every hectare of land used for human purposes is a hectare that can't be used for wild ecosystems, such as forests, such as wetlands, such as savannas, such as natural grasslands, for instance, all of which are far richer in nature and far richer in carbon than any farmed ecosystem is. So there's these enormous carbon and ecological opportunity costs of agricultural sprawl. So we should be minimizing the amount of land we use, but also minimizing the inputs on that land. And that requires a great deal of research and development in more benign, high yield farming. There's some very good examples around the world, far too few at the moment. But we absolutely should not be taking grade 4 or 5 land into production, particularly into arable production, which you just can't reasonably support. You get very low yields from it while doing a great deal of damage. In fact, there are some places where we shouldn't have ploughed the land. We should be returning it to its native ecosystems. And yet we have this sort of constant drive, which might be informing this question, this belief that every hectare of land must be used by humans. It's this biblical doctrine of dominion. We are the stewards of the land and it is our duty to use it. But in so many places, it makes much more sense to leave the land alone, where farming is very low yield, and this is particularly upland sheep farming. It's extremely low yielding. My estimates suggest we are occupying 4 million hectares in this country are occupied by upland sheep farming, which produces less than 1% of our calories. That's more land than all the grain growing in the United Kingdom. It just makes no sense at all to be doing that, especially as it takes place entirely at public expense. It's only happening because of the money that you and I are paying out of our pockets in subsidies for this highly destructive practice. So that land should be returned to nature, but good land, grades 1 and 2, should be used for food production, but we need radically to change those methods to ensure we can sustain that production and feed the world without devouring the planet.
Right, thank you. I've got a quickie here from Sue. She's commenting, and rightly, that vineyards are springing up all over the South Downs. How is this allowed? And obviously you wouldn't know either, but I mean, you wouldn't welcome it, would you? I'm sure.
No, I mean, they're often associated with high levels of soil erosion and high levels of pesticide and fungicide use. So I don't think it's a good idea. The fundamental issue is that we have so little control over the decisions farmers make. You know, we have a certain amount of public say in the decisions that developers make, but when the 1946 Town and Country Planning Act was going through Parliament, there was a big discussion as to whether it should cover agriculture or not. And they decided that as agriculture was basically a small-scale, low-impact activity, which it primarily was at the time, and quite a lot of it was still horse-drawn, it was never going to pose any major threat to the living world or to landscape values. And so they decided that there should be no public say in the decisions that farmers make. You can't object. There's no planning process, even if you have a radical change in land use within the farming envelope. And so almost immediately after the act was passed, farming began to change radically, move over to this highly mechanized approach. Field boundaries were destroyed, fields got bigger and bigger, and we saw very major landscape and environmental impacts inflicted. And we had no say, and ever since we've had no say. And I think that's the real democratic deficit.
Okay. A question, I have to do this one because he's a trustee, so of course got to look after him, from Paul. The historic landscape of the South Downs is human-made. Is your view that this should all be rewilded so that sheep can no longer graze on it?
No, I don't think it should all be rewilded. I think there should be parts where we retain a sort of museum of former farming practices and former human-made landscapes. That's all right, as long as we know what we're doing, as long as we don't confuse that with self-willed ecosystems, which tend to be far richer in species. We also need what ecologists call an intermediate disturbance regime. We need herbivores in the landscape, just not nearly so many. So what they're doing at NEP, for instance, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, is very interesting. It's what is technically called non-trophic rewilding. So in other words, it doesn't have large predators, and it doesn't have it has some wild herbivores, but it mostly has domestic herbivores. It's led, as you know, to a massive improvement in nature there, and it's created an intermediate disturbance regime, which means that you have some disruption, but not too much, and that enables a mosaic of habitats to form. But the great mistake which many people have made is to say, oh, look, they're using animals, they've got livestock, they've got pigs and cattle, pigs and cattle in the landscape. Therefore, having pigs and cattle in the landscape improves ecosystems. But we're talking about radically different systems. So NEP produces 56 kilos of meat per hectare per year. If all the agricultural land in the country was turned into NEP, we would each have, 30 calories a day of meat and nothing else. It's not a production system in any meaningful sense. Meat is a tiny byproduct of the ecological system that they've created. But unfortunately, people, because we're so food innumerate, they don't see those numbers, and they just see, oh, well, there's cattle, therefore having cattle is regenerative and having cattle is good. But actually anything which remotely resembles a beef production system operates on radically different principles, where you have very little nature, indeed, huge areas of land farmed to produce, well, certainly more food than NEP, but far less food than we actually need. I mean, if we were to do what some celebrity chefs tell us to do and switch to eating pasture-fed meat, and we were all to do that, we would need several planets, and there would be no space on any of them for wild ecosystems because of the enormous land area required for pasture-fed cattle, or for that matter, pasture-fed sheep. So it's a highly inefficient production system at the best of times, but NEP isn't even in any meaningful sense a production system, and it should not be confused with a production system.
No. I've now got 18 questions here, which we haven't got time for. So I think we'll call it a day here, George. A comment from David Brookshaw, who's a long-term member of the Society. A very interesting and well-delivered talk. Can I do a hear on that one? It was brilliant. I expected it to be controversial and thought-provoking, and of course it was. And I've always said to people that it's very difficult in this day and age to do a good talk without a PowerPoint. Only exceptional talkers can do that, and that's just what you've done. Thank you very much indeed. We do appreciate you coming.
Thank you very much, David. Great to meet you all. Thanks for having me, and good luck with everything you're doing. And thank you for all your wonderful work.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Bye then.
Bye.